Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Welcome to our third webinar in our webinar series. Today we have a very large group of clients joining us today. We'd like to thank you for participating in what we hope to be a very informative session on the differences between the U.S. and Canada with respect to consumer regulations. Over the years, we found that many of our clients are interested in learning about the U.S. and Canadian consumer regulations, which is why we've decided to add this topic to our webinar series. We may share a border, but we are very different in the information that's required on our labels. I'm hoping today that in our webinar, we shed some light on what some of the differences that we know our clients come across when trying to sell their consumer products cross-border. Today, we plan on focusing on the non-registered chemical consumer products for sale in Canada and the U.S. Our speakers today will be myself and my colleague, Ivy Tang. My name is Kirsten Alcock, and I'm the manager of the Product Safety Department here at Dell Tech. I've been working here for just over 20 years, authoring safety data sheets, doing your label regulations for consumers and workplace. I consult on transportation for TDG here in Canada, DOT in the U.S., IMDG, as well as IATA for your international needs. And I've had plenty of roles over the years here. I've been a member with a variety of organizations such as the CCSPA, SCHC. We are members with ISSA as well, which help keep us abreast of any changes that impact our clients. My colleague Ivy will now introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Ivy, and I've been working in the Product Safety Department here at Dell Tech with Kirsten for the past 4 years. In addition to authoring SDSs, I also accept CCCR reports and provide consumer label reviews and specialize in CCCR Checklist, which we will discuss in detail near the end of the presentation. I also work with our e-liquid clients on their consumer labels and provide consulting services for those regulations in addition to DOT and TDG regulations.
Before we jump into the regulations, we just wanted to share some of the services that we have here to offer at Dell Tech. Many of our clients will come to us for one service, but be not aware of all these other services that we can provide for your company. So here at Dell Tech, we have a variety of services to help our clients with compliance. We're a little bit of a one-stop shop here as we offer not only consulting services, but we have a lab in-house to do most of the physical testing that's required for the regulations we are going to discuss today. So if we look through the list here, we've got U.S. and Canadian consumer label consulting, which I know a lot of you are interested in, and that is one of our core things that we do here. We offer claim support and performance testing. So for example, if you'd like to test your consumer product to see how it stacks up against your competitors, we can help you with that. We deal with Green Steel, Eco-Loco, EPA Safer Choice, which is something that many of our clients are taking an interest in at this point in time. Many of you are not aware that we actually author SDSs as well. So we do U.S. and Canadian SDSs, and I personally have developed an in-house proprietary template which combines both the U.S. and Canadian SDSs. This is unique to Dell Tech in that most authoring systems only provide one document for each country. So we're happy to help you out there. We also have e-liquids and vaping device regulations, which was something new to Canada over the past couple of years. Ivy specializes in these regulations and has helped many of our clients over the past couple of years with their requirements. Last week, in particular, Health Canada advised of some potential changes to the vaping regulations. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please give us a call. You also can follow us on Twitter or our personal LinkedIn pages for information. We're always updating information as well. New regulations are coming into effect, which include cannabis and packaging in Canada as well. We're just kind of our one-stop shop here. So we've got cosmetic notifications, pesticide registration, medical device labeling, NHP and our registration team, which is headed up by Terry and Sarah. We offer translations of documents into French. Many of our clients need the remainder of the label translated. As you know, we're bilingual here, so please do contact us for that and don't use Google Translate because it can cause a lot of issues with your labels. Last but not least, we also do transportation consulting. So do you need to know how to ship your product? What are the specific requirements for the different modes? Is the DOT different than Canada? In some cases, it can be, and an example of this would be NA 1993 versus UN 1993. We also wanted to remind you that the information today that you'll be hearing is not legal advice. If you're uncertain about the interpretation of the CCCR and CPSC regulations, please contact Health Canada or the Consumer Product Safety Commission directly. We have their information here. If you're concerned about confidentiality, we can absolutely contact these agencies on your behalf with any questions that you have. This is something that we have done many times for our clients. Although we can help guide you with the regulations, we are not the regulators, so we cannot give you exemptions to the existing regulations. If there's something in particular to your product that you feel you need an exemption on, we can contact the regulators on your behalf and help facilitate the conversation. So here's an outline of what we'll be discussing. Our main focus today is regulations themselves for both countries for non-registered products and some of the differences that we find that impact our customers mostly. Please note that this webinar is not intended to be an all-encompassing presentation of the ins and outs of CCCR or the CPSC. The regulations for both countries are very complex, so we would just be touching on some of the main classifications and some basic label requirements that you will need for each country. My main focus in particular will be on the Canadian regulations, whereas my colleague Ivy will present on some of the US CPSC regulations that impact your labels. Now I'd like to turn over the presentation to Ivy to discuss what a consumer product is.
So it's important that we go over the difference between a consumer product and a workplace product, because that is by far the most common question that we receive. So on the slide before you, we do have specific definitions, but a consumer product is essentially a product used in a household environment or for personal uses. They're basically products that are marketed directly to consumers. It's something that you or I can buy off a shelf in a store or online. A consumer product might be made for non-professional use, even though the product itself is designed for professional use. For example, a bottle of car wax might be a professional product, also used by workers in the automotive industry, but when you or I purchase that bottle from a retail location, it's considered a consumer product. In this presentation, we will be discussing non-registered chemical consumer products. These are products that we can commonly find in places like Walmart, a Myers, a Home Depot, on Amazon, etc. So here's an example of products that we encounter often in our daily lives. To the left, we have products applicable to our conversation today, detergents, cleaners, diffusers, etc. To the right, we have products that require additional registrations or notifications and do not fall under the regulations that we are discussing today. So things like soaps, drugs, cosmetics, pesticides, natural health products, etc. must follow their own set of regulations. Since consumer products are sold and used in different environments than workplace products, separate regulations are required to address the hazards that might be unique to each setting. For example, a consumer product that's toxic might require child-resistant packaging, but that wouldn't be necessary or make any sense in a workplace. GHS is an international standard that covers hazardous chemicals in the workplace or for transport. It's intended for workers, transport workers, and emergency responders. And as you can see, workplace and consumer regulations have their own classification system. They use different language and labeling schemes and symbols, and they use different test methods in some cases. The average consumer is not trained to understand GHS label elements, so these regulations should not be used interchangeably. You should not see GHS symbols, which is the one with the red diamond, on a consumer product if you are purchasing that product in a retail location. So that brings us to our two regulatory bodies that we are talking about today. In Canada, we have the Canada Consumer Product Safety Act, and under this act, we have the Consumer Chemicals and Containers Regulations, which we call the CCCR 2001, or at Dell Tech, we like to call it the triple CR because it just rolls off the tongue a bit easier. The American Consumer Product Safety Act is established under the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission, or the CPSC. So if you manufacture or sell the same product to both the US and to Canada, you will need to follow two separate regulations to make sure your packaging and labeling are compliant with the country that it's actually in.
So I'm going to jump in here and talk a little bit about the CCCR regulations in Canada. The CCCR contains 5 main classification categories, which we've listed here. So we've got your toxic, we've got your corrosive, flammable, quick skin bonding adhesives, and pressurized containers. Most of these classifications have what we refer to as subcategories, and these are dependent on a variety of toxicological properties, anything from oral LD50 values to irritation, corrosion, or physical properties based on flammability levels. In addition to these, there are substances of special concern for toxicity that you're required to look at. There are currently 10 chemicals on this list, and if at certain levels your classification is already prescribed for you. For example, if your product contains any amount of carbon tetrachloride, you are given the subcategory of very toxic. We've listed the main categories here with their subcategories, and as you can see, some of them have many subcategories, such as the flammability. Flammability categories can be based on the flash point of a liquid to how long the flame projection is for an aerosol. One thing to note is that certain classifications can lead to the product being prohibited. For example, unlike the workplace regulations, the length of the flame projection can lead to the product being prohibited for sale in Canada. So that's very important that you understand the differences here between the two, because when we're looking at an SDS and it says that there's a long flame projection, what we need to know is that which test have you been using, and if it's too long, then you are banned in Canada, and that can be a serious issue. So please get these checked out ahead of time. If you know you're going to be selling in Canada, make sure that you're doing the right test. If you're unsure and you need help with this test, we can do these for you. Our lab is capable of performing all the required testing for aerosol flammability in Canada and the U.S. One thing to note is that the CCCR, or triple CR as we like to call it, is very prescriptive. This information is written right into the regulations and is quite easy to locate. The endpoints for each category are set out easily in tables. Like we say below, once your classification is determined, simply use the prescribed hazard statements and symbols on your label. The glossary statements are set out right in the regulations in both English and Canadian French. There are a variety of different ways to translate sentences, so these have been provided to us, which leads to a uniform label throughout Canada. One other thing to note here is the French language law requirements. Be sure that your label is using the prescribed font size as calculated, and on the remainder, you will be required to have the font size of French of equal prominence. So you may not make the French verbiage smaller than the English. So if you're planning on selling to Quebec, please ensure that you are not making your font size smaller. CCCR 2001 has 62 sections followed by 4 schedules, which include our general requirements. So this is your record keeping, how long you want to keep the data, data sources, where are you getting your data from, and these hazard categories. We're concerned about container performance here and design. This includes requirements and exemptions for child-resistant containers. CRCs are very important for your containers and are dependent on the classification of your product. The presentation of information is also here, such as your technical specifications for print, fonts, language, color contrast is also important. Please talk to your marketing team about the colors used on your label to ensure you're getting the right contrast. The location of where all the information must appear is also important, and the order on your main display panel, otherwise known as MDP. Some of the CCCR information is mandated at the front of the label, centered, whereas the remainder must be left justified elsewhere on the back or side. The main panel display is always tricky for our clients. This is determined not by your label size, but by the area that you have available for printing. We've seen many companies try to put a very small label on a very large jug. This is not how Health Canada wants one to label their product. You must determine the area of the bottle that is available, and from there calculate the font size and the symbol size requirements. We also have the classification and determination for all 5 categories here, which can be found in these sections, and the test methods required for Canada. These are not always the same as the U.S. The flame projection method is actually different. Make sure that you're using the test prescribed in the schedules. Another great source of information would be the CCCR reference manual, which is available online. This is to be used in conjunction with the regulations. It provides some clarification on the regulations themselves, and we use them all the time here at Dell Tech. So, steps. Well, how do we start? First, you need to determine if you're exempt. Are you making any kill claims? Is this intended as a pesticide? Are you intending this as a hand soap and therefore this is a cosmetic? Discuss with your marketing team on how you want to sell your product. You may be in fact exempt from the CCCR. You need to determine all the hazard categories that you fall into, if at all applicable. Gather all of your sources of information. Have you tested the product as a whole for irritancy or toxicity? Although rare, some of our clients have tested the product and this information must be used. Determination of your main display panel, which I just talked about in the last slide. This can sometimes be a very tricky part on where to measure. There are so many types of bottles available now than in the past. It can be hard to determine where you should start measuring from. We have a copy of the older CCCR, which contained pictures of where to measure. It's unfortunate this did not make it into the newer regulations. So if you need help on where to measure, let us know. We sometimes ask our clients to send an empty bottle to us, and we're always happy to ensure that we're measuring from the right part. From here, we simply refer to the regulations once you have it classified. The regulations tell you the symbols that you have to use. They advise of all the statements that you must use in English and Canadian French, as well as your print specifications. Here we have a couple of pictures demonstrating on where to measure on the bottles to determine your main display panel. This slide is a sample of the information that's available online to help guide you on the classification of your product as a whole. As you can see, the tables are very clear and concise in the regulations. This table, for example, shows you the cutoff values for oral toxicity. It gives the cutoff and then provides you with a subcategory you would fall under. So right here we have harmful selected as our LD50 was between 500 milligrams and 2,000 milligrams. So the next slide we have here is once we've determined that it's harmful, we can then go to the applicable table. So this here we have a picture of the harmful table that's available in the regulations. And as you can see, it's not only in English, but also in Canadian French, as we are bilingual. So we provide the hazard symbols, the signal word, primary hazard statements, and specific hazard statements are available here in both official languages. Things to note that if the table indicates that the wording is capitalized, you must capitalize it. In some cases, it will give you choices of phrases. So this one in particular ended up being cut off. I apologize for that. But we're actually given the choice of contents may be harmful or fumes harmful would be underneath there. This is a choice that you must make for your product. There are some phrases that must be in bold, such as first aid treatment. This information will all be located in the tables in the appropriate spots throughout the regulations. If you see the word poison twice, you only need it once on your label. Poison, obviously, is the same in English and French. You only need to have the symbol once. You will need to have both the words caution and attention, however, on the front of the label because they are different in English and French. And do not forget your accents for the French. It's imperative that they are included on your label. This slide, we have information on how to determine the sizes of your hazard symbols, signal words, and when some phrases are required for small containers, when they're not required for small containers. You must follow this chart based on your main display panel. We follow the metric system in Canada, so please ensure that you're not treating these as inches. I'm going to send you back to my colleague Ivy to talk about some of the U.S. requirements.
All right, on to the CPSC for the U.S. regulations. So as you can tell, the CPSC regulations have many more classification categories than the CCCR regulations. They include highly toxic, toxic, chronic toxic, corrosive, irritant, strong sensitizers, flammable, combustible, etc., or any combination of the above. And while the CPSC labeling requirements do also include a signal word, an affirmative statement of the principal hazard, precautionary measures, first aid, etc., CPSC is not as prescriptive as the CCCR. So what exactly do we mean by not as prescriptive? Well, for the CCCR, you could tell the process is very simple. You classify your product, and you'll be told exactly what to print on your label. But the CPSC is not organized in such a way. First of all, only one symbol is ever used for the CPSC, and that's for highly toxic substances, and it's the skull and crossbones, as you can see on the slide. Secondly, the signal word danger is only required for extremely flammable, corrosive, or highly toxic products. For all other hazardous substances, you can choose between caution or warning on your U.S. label. You can also create your own precautionary and first aid statements, as well as the instructions for handling and storage. There isn't much prescribed wording under the CPSC regulations. However, you do need to have the statement keep out of reach of children or an equivalent statement if appropriate, and you must have instructions to read cautionary material elsewhere on the label if there is more than one principal display panel. For example, you might have the sentence, read reverse panel for cautionary labeling, or something to that effect on the front of your container so the consumer knows to flip to the back. And like the substances of special concern found in the Canadian CCCR, the CPSC also has a special list. This is called the Specific Toxic Substances List, which also necessitates additional labeling requirements. Before you is an incomplete list displaying several of the substances found. For example, if your product has 10% or more petroleum distillates or 4% methanol, your label must have the signal word danger and the statement harmful or fatal if swallowed and call physician immediately. The CPSC does have minimum font size requirements as well. Determine what your main display panel area is in square inches, not in square centimeters, and use the table to find out how small your font can be for your signal word, your statement of hazard, and other cautionary materials. Please note that the U.S. uses the imperial system, so the numbers here are in fractional inches. There are differences between this chart and the one that we showed for the CCCR regulations. As Kirsten said, the font sizes do not necessarily match up. For example, if you have a main display panel of 7 square inches, your signal word on a U.S. label needs to be 3/32 of an inch, which is equivalent to 2.38 millimeters. However, a main display panel of 7 square inches is equivalent to 45 square centimeters, which requires a signal word of 3.3 millimeters on your Canadian label, which is a bit bigger. So there is a size difference in your signal words. So this brings us to some of the differences between Canadian and U.S. consumer regulations as it pertains to labeling. The first and biggest difference that we've talked about is that Canada needs French labeling. French is an official language in Canada, and your labels should be bilingual. This is not the case in the U.S., where only English is mandatory, and some of our clients choose to put Spanish labeling as well. Second, the CPSC allows for chronic hazards, so things like carcinogens, reproductive hazards, and sensitizers. You will not find these classification categories in the Canadian consumer regulations, nor will you see reference to them on a Canadian label. Again, for hazard labeling, Canada uses the signal words extreme danger, caution, and danger. The U.S. only uses danger and then you have a choice between warning or caution. Once more, statements are prescribed for CCCR, but not necessarily for the CPSC. And there's a difference in the symbols used. Canada uses a variety of symbols for consumer labeling, but the U.S. only uses one. Less obvious differences include the following. So for inhalation toxicity, for CPSC, we use the units milligrams per liter per 1 hour, but the CCCR uses milligrams per liter for 4 hours. So you will need to convert the LC50 values that you have. And the CCCR regulations do provide the formulas for both gases and vapors, and dust and fumes that you use to switch between X hours and 4 hours. For oral toxicity, the CPSC cuts off at 5,000 milligrams per kilogram, but the CCCR uses a cutoff of 2,000 milligrams per kilogram. So you might have a product that isn't toxic for CCCR, but is actually considered toxic for the CPSC, and that will affect what's required on a Canadian versus a U.S. consumer label. There's also a variety of exemptions that are found in the regulations, but the most common one that our clients encounter is small container exemption in the CCCR. If your container is small enough that the main display panel is less than 35 square centimeters, you do not have to print all the precautionary statements or first aid statements. However, this exemption is not found in the CPSC. In fact, they suggest that you use a foldback label, a pull-off tag, or some sort of accordion label instead, which is strictly not allowed for CCCR due to the Canadian requirements for the durability of your label. And lastly, to rope in the GHS workplace regulations once more, this is a bit tricky to explain, but I'll try my best. So Canadian consumer labeling can replace Canadian workplace labeling if the product meets certain requirements. So let's say you have a bottle of detergent and it's a 500 milliliter bottle, and you're selling that to both consumers and to the industry or commercial customers. In that case, your product label can just follow the consumer regulations. However, if you are selling that same detergent, so same formulation, and you're selling it to the industry in 1 liter bottles, so no longer 500 mils, but 1 liter bottles, that 1 liter bottle now needs to have GHS workplace labeling. It doesn't matter if the 1 liter bottle only makes up 1% of your sales. The fact that it's a different size bottle from what a consumer would find in a Walmart or any other retail location means that it's a workplace product and consumer labeling will not suffice. This is basically a long-winded way of saying that there are instances where Canadian consumer labeling can replace Canadian GHS labeling for these types of products, but not the other way around. A similar exemption is found for U.S. consumer labeling. It can replace U.S. workplace labeling, but only if you can prove that the frequency and duration of the product used in the workplace is equivalent to that of a consumer. The big question is, can you combine a U.S. and Canadian consumer label? In theory, yes, but we really do not recommend this. Because of all the differences that we just discussed, it is really difficult to make a compliant and fully comprehensive label unless the product is non-hazardous, which in that case, there's no symbol or hazard language that's really necessary. Combining your labels may also cause confusion for your customers and put consumer safety into jeopardy. U.S. consumers may not be familiar with the Canadian consumer hazard symbols or the hazard language that's being used. Part of consumer safety is making sure there is a consistent method of presenting this information across the board. And again, marketing issues may arise due to the chronic classifications found under the CPSC, but not the CCCR. The bilingual requirement also means that there is less space for U.S. information to be printed if you want to combine your labels, especially if you want a trilingual label for English, French, and Spanish. Good luck, because unless you have a really large container, it is super hard to fit all that information in. And remember, Canada does not allow peel-back labels. Lastly, you really run the risk of non-compliance in either country, which could result in a stop distribution order, or even worse, a product recall. And this results in monetary losses for you, and we know that no one wants to end up in this situation. We've seen businesses decide to simply remove their product from the Canadian market once they've been issued a stop sale, simply because they don't want to or they don't really know how to work with the Canadian compliance requirements, which is a real shame because there are so many great U.S. products out there that I would love to buy, but it's just not available on our shelves. We absolutely support Canadian businesses, but we also enjoy the variety of products that we get from the U.S. as well. So please make sure that your labels are compliant to begin with, and hopefully you will never have to run into that issue.
Okay, so I'm going to very briefly touch on some additional U.S. requirements that you may not be aware of. First things first, we have California Prop 65. This has been around for many years, but last year there were some changes that came about for new statements, a new pictogram and signal word requirement, and we have an example of this just off to the right here. If you're using any chemicals with a Prop 65, please be aware of these changes. Many of our clients are trying to reformulate these chemicals out, as it could be very difficult to sell your product with these new requirements. Another thing to note here is that the list is constantly changing. It's not static, so please check their website often. I believe they actually have an RSS feed, and you might want to get on that list. Another thing here is the VOC CARB regulations. VOC has become a very hot topic over the years, and the new regulations and endpoints have come about. California in particular has some very strict regulations on VOCs. You need to determine the category which is applicable to your product and then determine if you have exceeded it or not. Last but not least, our favorite and most controversial of all as of late is the New York DEC program. The enforcement has actually been delayed on this new set of regulations. There is much discussion surrounding the disclosure requirements for labels for this. Our colleague Joe specializes in all of the above three regulations. If you have any questions pertaining to these topics on this page, please contact Joe directly. We provided his information on the next slide, so I'll just leave this up for a second. And just quickly, I'd like to touch on the CCCR checklist. This document is a very thorough review and justification for the classification of your product here in Canada. Health Canada will request a copy of this document should they have any questions about your product that you're selling or if you're being audited. It's a very extensive document that must be filled out. They will ask you for your general provisions, your importation information, your classification, and packaging. We can help clients create these documents. It appears to be very daunting, but it's just really another way to organize all of your data and to be able to back up your product classification. This is definitely something that we specialize here at Dell Tech, and if you would like this with your product assessment, we can definitely do that for you. So with that, we've come to the end of our presentation. If there is a topic that interests you for future webinars, please send us an email. We're always welcoming your feedback, and we'd be happy to make sure that we're, having webinars on things that you find important when you're dealing with selling your products here in Canada or the U.S. We'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon about this webinar. We will be taking a break on webinars during the summertime. As we know, everybody is going to be enjoying the sunshine. We sure will in Canada, as it was a pretty rough winter this year. But we will be back in September to help you out with any questions. If you have a specific question about what you want to see in webinars, do not hesitate to give us a shout. We want to be here for you, and we want to help you to sell your products. As Ivy said, we like to have more products in Canada. We like that availability. So please, please consider selling your products here, and if you need help with that, we are here to help you. So thanks again for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye from Dell Tech.